This is the iconic performance by Marilyn Monroe at President Kennedy's birthday celebration. Marilyn had affairs with both the president and his brother, the Kennedys. 3 months after this performance, the actress would be found dead. John Kennedy would be assassinated a year later, and his brother would be gunned down 5 years after that. The deaths of all three would spark countless mysteries and conspiracies. What really happened? Who or what killed America's most famous actress at the age of 36, at the height of her career? Spoiler, no one knows the absolute truth, but we'll explore the theories. In this video, you'll get the complete biography of the legendary actress, from a shy girl in an orphanage to a treasure of American culture. This won't be a dull biography. Of course, we'll talk about high art, society, and history, but we'll also, for instance, dive deep into the actress's nude photographs. Right now, I'll tell you about the public and private life of a cinematic legend, what she hid and who she truly was as an actress, model, and sex symbol. You may not have seen a single film starring this legendary blonde, and that's okay. Even without watching her movies, everyone knows who Marilyn Monroe is, what she looked like, and what she represents. What's the secret? Her last film came out 60 years ago, and many question her acting talent, even suggesting that any curvy blonde could have taken her place. So why is Marilyn Monroe one of the most enduring symbols of American culture? Let's dive into some history. The story really takes off in 1953. By then, Marilyn Monroe was already a fairly well-known actress, but that year, she became a true star. That's when the films How to Marry a Millionaire and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes hit theaters. It was from these movies that the world learned that diamonds are a girl's best friend. The films were massive hits, but more importantly, they cemented her iconic image, a slightly ditzy, naive, yet irresistibly alluring blonde with voluptuous curves and undeniable sex appeal. That sexual magnetism was something both audiences and producers couldn't get enough of. Marilyn Monroe was the perfect embodiment of the beauty standards of her time. The 1950s, America's first post-war decade, were marked by an economic boom and a baby boom. A married woman with several children was the role model. The hourglass figure, ample bust, hips, and a tiny waist was the ideal of femininity. Today, everyone's trying to lose weight, but in the 50s, American women were encouraged to gain it. Being skinny was decidedly uncool. Magazine ads practically shouted, "Men don't want your bones, pack on the pounds." Obviously, curves alone wouldn't make you a superstar. A huge part of Marilyn's sex appeal and charisma came from her utterly unique way of moving and speaking. Directors leaned heavily into her famous, swaying walk in various films. Her voice and its soft, distinctive tone were one of a kind. Early in her career, her quiet voice was a problem, and she worked extensively with a coach to project louder. Ultimately, that voice became her calling card.
Enjoying your trip? How many times have you cried?
Perhaps the most captivating aspect of Marilyn's allure was the blend of innocence in her facial expressions with her raw sex appeal. This created a unique effect. It drew in male audiences while not alienating women. In the 1950s, America was still under the grip of the infamous Hays Code, essentially a form of government censorship enforcing moral standards. The code banned profanity, nudity, and sex in films, discouraged depictions of violence or immoral behavior, and even frowned upon overly long kisses, especially with villainous characters. And that was just the start of the restrictions. But as we know, you can ban sex from the screen, and people will still crave it. In Marilyn's scenes, directors managed to skirt the rules, showing nothing explicitly forbidden yet still infusing the screen with palpable sexual tension. It worked like a charm on audiences.
Like I almost never get to meet really interesting.
In 1955, the film The 7 Year, it hit theaters, the one with the legendary scene where Marilyn's dress is blown upward by a subway grate. A few years later, Some Like It Hot premiered in cinemas. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe was arguably the most famous woman in the world. She was adored in America and beyond. Millions dreamed of speaking with her, touching her, getting her number. But just a couple of years later, everything would change. She would be lonely and despondent. On an early Sunday morning in August 1962, she would be found dead in her bedroom. At the same time, FBI agents would visit the local telephone company's office and seize records of Marilyn's phone calls. Those records remain missing to this day. Who was she calling in the hours before her death, and what happened to this legendary actress? Was it suicide or murder? To figure it out, let's start from the beginning. Marilyn Monroe's drama began before she was even born. Her mother, Gladys Monroe, worked with film negatives at a Los Angeles studio. Charles Gifford was her boss and boyfriend. On June 1st, 1926, a girl was born who, a couple of decades later, would become known to the world as Marilyn Monroe. For her parents, this was not a joyful event. Charles had just gone through a divorce, had no intention of starting a family, and vanished upon learning of the pregnancy. Gladys Monroe already had 2 failed marriages and 2 children, whom she'd left with her ex-husband. The newborn girl was named Norma Jean, her name for the first 20 years of her life. In some documents, her mother listed the surname of her first husband, Baker. In others, the surname of her second husband, Mortensen. The real father's surname never appeared anywhere. At the time, Gladys was 24. She still wanted to live her own life, not become a single mother. She'd already had a tough experience with her first 2 children, so she decided it would be better for someone else to raise the girl. For the first 7 years of her life, Norma Jean lived with the Bollanders, a devout and strict couple who, in addition to Norma, fostered several other children, receiving state payments for each. Meanwhile, not only did her own mother refuse to raise her, but so did her grandmother, Della Monroe, who lived nearby. When Norma Jean was 1 year old, her grandmother burst into the Bollanders' home and tried to smother her granddaughter with a pillow. One of the foster parents intervened and called the police. Della Monroe was sent to a psychiatric hospital where she was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, known today as bipolar disorder. A month later, Della Monroe died. When Norma Jean was 6, she first said she wanted to be an actress. Her foster parents, the Bollanders, reacted harshly. They were religious and forbade the children from watching movies. "We go to church, they go to the movies," they'd say. In 1933, when Norma Jean was 7, her mother decided she was finally ready to take on parenting. She bought a house on credit and took her daughter back. Gladys and Norma got furniture and a beautiful piano. Both felt like a new life was beginning. A few months later, Gladys had a nervous breakdown. At the hospital, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She would spend much of her life in psychiatric institutions. Years later, as a famous actress, Marilyn Monroe would buy back that same piano from her childhood home and place it in her New York apartment. After Gladys's diagnosis, her daughter briefly lived with various foster families before ending up in an orphanage. According to Marilyn's recollections, it was the worst place on earth. She couldn't comprehend why she was there. Norma Jean despised the orphanage's strict schedule and rules. She claimed she was constantly bullied. A quiet and shy child, she may have exaggerated or demonized the orphanage in her memories. Many who worked there described it as a nearly model institution. It's possible that Norma Jean simply couldn't cope with the fact of being in an orphanage, which shaped a negative image in her mind. One of Marilyn's future husbands, playwright Arthur Miller, recalled that throughout her life, she could walk into a room and instantly spot anyone who had ever been an orphan. When he asked how she did it, Marilyn said that every orphan's eyes held an endless void and loneliness. In 1937, Grace Goddard, a longtime friend of Norma Jean's mother, became her official guardian. Even so, the girl continued to bounce between families, living with one set of relatives and then another. According to Marilyn, it was during this time that she experienced abuse. She never specified a particular person or family. Marilyn was, in fact, one of the first stars to openly speak about surviving abuse. This claim is debated, but indirect signs supported it. For the rest of her life, Marilyn struggled with low self-esteem, couldn't maintain long-term relationships, and suffered from nightmares, shame, and suicidal thoughts, all common among adults who experience childhood abuse. In the early 1940s, Grace Goddard and her family planned to move to another state and didn't want to take Norma along. Grace decided to arrange a marriage for her. She found a suitable candidate right next door, 21-year-old James Doherty, a handsome young man who worked at an aviation plant. At 16, without finishing high school, Norma Jean married for the first time. The newlyweds settled in a small house. In marriage, Norma Jean felt odd, like a child playing the role of a perfect wife. Both spouses later recalled feeling like strangers to each other. Yet, in a way, this failed marriage set Norma Jean on the path to her Hollywood career. A couple of years into the marriage, James Doherty took a job as a merchant marine and embarked on a long voyage across the Pacific. 18-year-old Norma Jean moved in with his parents, who got her a job at a factory making radio-controlled airplanes. One day, a photographer visited the plant, taking pictures of women on the assembly line to boost the morale of American soldiers. He was the first to notice that the camera loved Norma Jean. She put together a portfolio and submitted it to a modeling agency. In 1945, at 19, Norma Jean signed her first contract. Back then, there was no hint of the legendary sex appeal in the young woman. The agency classified her as a girl next door, a wholesome, approachable type you might meet in your neighborhood. She modeled extensively, appearing on the covers of American and international magazines. At some point, the agency convinced her to dye her hair, and Norma Jean became a blonde. During this time, her husband, James Doherty, was docked in Argentina. He got his hands on a magazine featuring Norma on the cover. "Look, that's my wife," he told his fellow sailors, who smirked skeptically. Her success in modeling caught the attention of casting agents at 20th Century Fox. After several screen tests, she landed a one-year contract with a modest salary. One studio executive remarked that Norma Jean didn't sound like a movie star's name. He suggested Marilyn, and she took her mother's maiden name, Monroe. Thus, the actress Marilyn Monroe was born. In 1946, Marilyn was 20. Her husband, James Doherty, had just returned from a 2-year voyage, expecting his wife to resume her role as a homemaker. But Norma Jean had changed not just her name, but her ambitions. She wanted to focus on becoming a movie star. The couple divorced. During her first contract's term, Marilyn Monroe appeared in a few bit parts. Some of these roles were as brief as, "Notice Marilyn Monroe? That's Marilyn." 2 words, 2 seconds on screen. A year later, the studio opted not to renew her contract. That's when Marilyn realized the cutthroat nature of the industry she'd entered. There was no shortage of young, attractive women. Her fate now rested solely in her hands. For a young actress without a contract, tough times followed. She landed occasional photo shoots, but sometimes the money wasn't enough for food. Alone and jobless, Marilyn found an unusual pastime. She'd put on a tight sweater and stroll down Hollywood Boulevard, soaking in the admiring glances of passers-by. She craved attention and needed to be liked, especially by men. Even a decade or two ago, Hollywood had a casting couch culture. In the 1940s and 50s, an era of male dominance in the industry, a young, pretty woman aiming for the screen had few options. Hollywood at the time hosted parties where influential industry figures mingled. Young, attractive women were also present, many hoping to make connections to break into the big leagues. Naturally, this often involved sex. Marilyn found such a patron in Joseph Schenck, a Russian immigrant and powerful producer, then in his late 60s or early 70s. Thanks to Schenck, Marilyn Monroe secured a 6-month contract with Columbia Pictures and a role in a low-budget musical, Ladies of the Chorus. She played a minor character. The film, released in 1948, flopped and Columbia didn't renew her contract. Ironically, in the 1950s, when Marilyn became a star, the studio re-released the film with new posters prominently featuring her name and image. With the Columbia contract and Schenck's support gone, Marilyn was jobless again. She sought another patron, this time Johnny Hyde, a vice president at a top talent agency. In his 50s, he was smitten with Marilyn and became her lover. Through Hyde's influence, Monroe landed roles in The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve. Both films were hits with audiences and critics alike. In 1951, both earned multiple Oscar nominations. Marilyn's roles weren't leading ones, but producers and audiences started to notice her. 20th Century Fox signed her to a new 7-year contract. Initially, it paid her $500 a week, decent money, but a far cry from the salaries of today's Hollywood stars. The contract brought her new, more prominent roles. Gradually, she earned her status as a sex symbol. The year 1952 was pivotal for Marilyn's career. That's when Clash by Night and Don't Bother to Knock hit theaters. Both were dramatic thrillers among the few serious roles in Marilyn Monroe's career. Watch these films and you'll see she was a solid actress, not a genius, perhaps, but far from the talentless figure some make her out to be. At 26, Marilyn wasn't yet a megastar, but was gaining recognition. Around the same time, barbershops, garages, and men's locker rooms across America started displaying posters of a nude blonde against a red backdrop. Many recognized her as Marilyn Monroe. I can't show these photos in full. This is YouTube, after all. If you're curious, Google is your friend. Let me just say there's nothing there that would shock a 2025 internet user. But in the early 50s, it was scandalous, basically pornography. For a known actress, nude photos could mean career suicide. Playboy magazine didn't even exist yet. The heads of 20th Century Fox were furious. They urged Marilyn to publicly deny that she was the woman in the photos. Instead, she did the opposite. She openly admitted they were hers. In interviews, Marilyn explained that years earlier, when she was broke and out of work, she had posed nude. It was a bold move. The story gripped the nation. Never before had the public seen nude photos of a famous actress. Marilyn knew she was already being called a sex symbol, and the photos would only fuel interest in her rising star. In short, the woman was savvy and knew how to generate buzz long before it was mainstream. The films released in 1953 were wildly successful. Niagara, How to Marry a Millionaire, and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes packed theaters. The scandalous photos weren't the only reason, but they certainly helped. Marilyn Monroe became a superstar and America's ultimate sex symbol. That same year, the first issue of Playboy hit stands with Marilyn Monroe on the cover and those red backdrop photos inside. It was well-earned fame for a woman who was always shy and soft-spoken. She had come a long way. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was a musical filled with song and dance. Marilyn Monroe obsessively perfected every move. She worked with a vocal coach and choreographer, often rehearsing long after a full day of shooting. This dedication made the issue of her pay all the more glaringly unfair. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell played the leads. Jane earned $150,000 for the film. Marilyn, still under her 7-year 20th Century Fox contract, was paid just $1,500 a week, despite her films raking in millions. The studio bosses refused to renegotiate her contract. First, why pay more if they didn't have to? Second, Marilyn was difficult to work with. Even before her star-making roles, she was often late to set, required multiple takes, and always had an acting coach on hand to monitor her performance and give notes. Most directors weren't thrilled about this. The massive success of her light-hearted comedies solidified her persona as a ditzy, sexy blonde. The studio operated on a give me the same, but different philosophy, casting Marilyn in similar roles. Her own opinions didn't matter. Her next project was set to be a musical comedy with Frank Sinatra. This time, Marilyn took a different approach. She was in a relationship with Joe DiMaggio, a legendary baseball player who had retired. In the US, he's known as Marilyn's second husband, but in the early 50s, he was arguably as famous as she was. They married and jetted off to Japan, where DiMaggio had business. Marilyn was supposed to be on the set of the Sinatra film, but instead flew to the other side of the world, ignoring calls and messages from the studio. During the trip, Marilyn Monroe realized the full extent of her fame. When their plane landed in Tokyo, thousands of Japanese fans awaited her, with police struggling to hold back the frenzied crowd. After Japan, Monroe and her husband flew to Korea, where she was invited to perform for American soldiers at a military base. The concert was outdoors in freezing weather. Footage shows bundled up soldiers in hats, while Marilyn performed in a revealing dress. She explained that this was how the soldiers wanted to see her. For Marilyn, the crowd's attention and adoration were vital. Joe DiMaggio hoped the studio issues and their marriage would prompt Monroe to consider retiring, but for Marilyn, that was unthinkable. It also became clear that, despite DiMaggio's fame, she was the true star of their marriage. Tensions and disagreements mounted, and the marriage lasted less than a year. Around this time, Marilyn Monroe began struggling with prescription pills. She had trouble sleeping and doctors prescribed medications, but she overused them, mixing pills with alcohol. She sometimes showed up on set in a dazed state. Still, this didn't significantly derail her career at the time. Marilyn managed to persuade the studio to revise her contract. Her salaries finally matched her star status, but more importantly, she gained creative freedom. She could choose projects and approve directors, a rare privilege for actors of that era. The Sinatra film never materialized, but her new projects promised even greater success. In 1955, the 7-year it premiered, one of the defining works of Marilyn Monroe's career. It told the story of a middle-aged man obsessed with fantasies about his alluring neighbor. The scene with the billowing white dress became iconic. The film was a critical and box office smash. That same year, Marilyn Monroe moved across the country to New York, where she enrolled in Lee Strasberg's prestigious actors' studio, studying the Stanislavski method, acting through deep emotional connection to a character. In New York, she founded her own company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, to oversee future projects. These moves underscored that, despite her on-screen persona as a flighty blonde, she was a sharp and ambitious woman in real life. During this period, Monroe began seeing a psychotherapist who identified her core psychological struggles, low self-esteem, a constant need for validation, fear of being unwanted, and an inability to sustain long-term relationships. These issues sharply contrasted with the carefree, seductive blonde the public adored. In New York, Marilyn began a romance with Arthur Miller, a renowned playwright and intellectual of his time. They married a year later, and Monroe returned to Los Angeles with her husband to resume work. Over the next few years, Marilyn's mental health issues became more pronounced. She starred in a few moderately successful films, but her erratic behavior complicated productions. Her reliance on pills and alcohol took a toll. At times, she couldn't deliver even simple lines, forcing shoots to be halted. The years from 1956 to 1958 were particularly challenging in Marilyn's personal life. She became pregnant twice. The first was an ectopic pregnancy requiring emergency surgery. A year later, she suffered a miscarriage. Despite these setbacks, Marilyn quickly returned to work to start filming a new movie, which would become the final major hit of her career, Billy Wilder's iconic comedy, Some Like It Hot. About two down-on-their-luck jazz musicians who disguised themselves as women to join an all-female band. The filming process was far from smooth. Leveraging her star power, Marilyn demanded that all other actresses in the film have darker hair than hers. Director Billy Wilder recounted that it once took Marilyn 80 takes to deliver a single line, "Where's that bourbon?" Instead, she kept saying, "Where's that whiskey?" Despite the conflicts and chaos on set, the film was a resounding success. Many critics still rank it among the greatest comedies in cinema history. Marilyn Monroe won a Golden Globe for her role. It was the pinnacle of her career as a legendary actress. Just a few years later, she would die alone. In 1960 and 1961, Marilyn's final two films were released: the musical comedy Let's Make Love and the drama The Misfits. Neither was a box office hit, and both received largely negative reviews. Talk began to circulate about the end of Marilyn Monroe's era. She was 35. The naive, almost childlike expression that audiences had fallen for was gone. Maintaining her sex symbol status was increasingly difficult. During the filming of her last two movies, she heavily abused pills and alcohol, sometimes landing in the hospital straight from the set. Working with her became nearly impossible. Around this time, she divorced Arthur Miller. For a brief period, Marilyn managed to pull herself together. She changed her hairstyle and lost weight. Though she knew it was time to evolve her image, she couldn't escape being the quintessential sexy blonde. Today, celebrities in similar situations turn to plastic surgery. Early in her career, Marilyn had a minor procedure on her chin, but in the early 60s, surgical options were limited. Doctors couldn't rejuvenate someone's appearance. Implants, for example, weren't yet common. In June 1962, Monroe did a famous photo shoot for Vogue. Initially, the photographer took some rather provocative shots. Marilyn was deeply upset with the results, disliking how her body looked. Ultimately, a new photo in a completely different style was used for the magazine. Despite her struggles in her final years, Monroe still captivated those around her, especially men. Beyond her marriages, she had romances with some of the biggest heartthrobs in America and the world: Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Eve Montan. In this context, an affair with President John F. Kennedy doesn't seem far-fetched. They crossed paths at several events in the early 60s. Kennedy had a playboy reputation, and rumors of his numerous affairs constantly swirled among the elite. Most modern biographers of Marilyn Monroe have little doubt that she had relationships with John Kennedy in 1961 and 1962, and later with his brother Bobby. Many who knew Monroe and the Kennedys at the time corroborated the affair. The main argument against this theory is the lack of documented evidence, like photographs. But the early 60s were a different era. Not everyone had a camera phone, and paparazzi didn't chase after scandalous shots of the president and his mistress. Unspoken journalistic ethics were stricter then. No reputable outlet would publish such photos, and for serious publications, reporting on the extramarital affairs of top officials was taboo. The famous photo of a couple embracing, where the woman resembles Monroe and the man looks like one of the Kennedys, is a fake. The only verified image capturing both brothers and Marilyn was taken at a party following a performance that would go down in history for one number. It was a grand event celebrating John F. Kennedy's birthday. Marilyn Monroe paused filming in Los Angeles to fly to New York for a single performance. It was after this event that many became convinced of a romance between Marilyn and the president, though in reality, their relationship was nearing its end. After that evening, the Kennedy brothers began distancing themselves from Marilyn, reportedly at the insistence of the President SAA's wife, Jackie Kennedy. A major blow for Marilyn Monroe was her firing from the film Something's Got to Give. She had left these very shoots to attend the Kennedy event in New York. Marilyn repeatedly disrupted production, unable to show up on set, which forced delays. Her dismissal came shortly after her 36th birthday. In her final years, she often referred to her age in separate digits, 3, 5, or 3, 6, as if afraid to say the full number aloud. On August 5th, 1962, 3 months after her birthday, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom. That fateful night, her housekeeper raised the alarm. At midnight, she stepped out of the guest house and noticed the light still on in Marilyn's bedroom. She knocked, got no response, and called the actress's psychotherapist. When he arrived, he broke the bedroom window and found Marilyn dead, clutching a telephone receiver. The sudden death of a superstar shocked the nation. Most Americans were unaware of the dramas unfolding in Marilyn's life. Her death sparked countless questions and mysteries. Authorities seized records of her phone calls from that night. Who she was calling remains unknown. The psychotherapist initially claimed he arrived shortly after midnight, but the police weren't called until around 4 a.m. What happened in those intervening hours in Marilyn Monroe's bedroom? Who else visited the house that night? Bobby Kennedy officially spent August 4th in San Francisco, but several witnesses claimed to have seen the president's brother in Los Angeles that day. Why would he lie about his whereabouts? There was a theory that the CIA or the Kennedys were behind Marilyn's death. In the 1980s, her case was even reopened, but no evidence of foul play was found. Both Kennedy brothers were assassinated within a few years of Monroe's death, adding to the mystique, though in reality, the events were unrelated. Most of Marilyn's biographers lean against the murder theory. When you examine her full life story, suicide emerges as the most plausible explanation. Mental illness ran in her family. She was a shy, lonely girl abandoned by her parents. Marilyn spent her life seeking approval and attention. She never managed to build a lasting family or have children. By her mid-30s, she knew she was losing the looks that had made her famous. The world was changing rapidly. The 60s demanded new heroes and icons. Yet, nearly 60 years later, it's clear that the legendary blonde was more than just a famous actress. Cinema has seen countless stars, but there was only one Marilyn Monroe.